historic Brattonsville, and today's Time Travel Tuesday we'll be learning about a few common misconceptions regarding slavery. While there's many resources out there for us to learn more about the topic, sometimes it can be a little bit confusing understanding which facts are true or which facts are not true. And today we'll explore some of those misconceptions. Alright, so the first common misconception is that slavery started in the United States in 1619. Now that date isn't completely incorrect, but if we think about the United States territory as we see it today, you can actually date back slavery in the United States back to 1513 when the Spanish colonized the island of Puerto Rico. Another common misconception you may have heard of or read somewhere is that the first slaves in America were Irish or European descent. Now that is not quite true. The first slaves in America were of indigenous and African descent. Now there were indentured servants, and many of those, or most of them, were of European descent. Indentured servants came from Europe to America. Many of them had lost their jobs during the 30 Years' War, while a great number of them were prisoners, so they used a lot of convict labor for indentured servitude. Now, indentured servants lived a fairly restricted life. However, their lives were not the same as being enslaved. There were some laws to protect their rights and some of their freedoms, and their contracts were usually from 4 to 7 years, and then after that, they were promised full freedom. Some of the contracts even included land, livestock, and new clothing. Now, in the early Virginia colony, the first Africans who were brought there were treated more similarly to indentured servants in a sense that there were no official slave codes yet. Slave codes were basically laws that told the slaves what they could and couldn't do. So things like not allowed to read and write, not allowed to leave a plantation, not allowed to marry or own property, things like that. But as time passed by, Virginia and other colonies did implement slave codes. In fact, South Carolina implemented the Negro Acts of 1735 later on as well. So another misconception is that when we think about slavery, we often think about the South. We're thinking of it as a Southern American issue, but slavery was actually very large in the sense that it was also in the northeastern colonies, or later on the states, until the 19th century. It was also found in the Caribbean and in Central and South America, as well as Europe. So the transatlantic slave trade was very vast, and it did not just affect the South. But we tend to think of the South more often because, unlike the North, the South turned slavery into an economy. So the South relied on the slave economy, while the North simply just had slaves in the area as well. So the next misconception we'll talk about is only a few white Southerners owned slaves. Now, in the beginning, if we take a look at what York County looked like when Colonel William Bratton settled here, that was the case. Colonel William Bratton was actually the exception. In 1790, according to census records, he owned 12 enslaved individuals, which actually was a lot for this area. Most of the larger plantations were rice plantations in the Low Country. So in the York County area, or in the Carolina Piedmont, there weren't as many enslaved people here because there weren't many plantations like in the Low Country. So there were about 1,000 enslaved African Americans in this area around the time of the American Revolution or shortly after. But later on, as we see slavery expand, we saw that the Bratton plantations expanded significantly in the 1800s. And by 1860, in South Carolina, 46% of white residents owned slaves. The last misconception we'll talk about is that Black Americans owned slaves too. Now, this was a rarity for a couple of reasons. One, if someone owned slaves, it meant that they had wealth and status. And we know that in a slave economy, if an African American were to own slaves, it would disrupt or interrupt that slave economy. Another reason is that there were a few African Americans who owned slaves. There were a few free people who would purchase their family members or their spouses and later on emancipate them as well. So the main function of owning slaves as an African American was usually to free your own loved ones. Also, another reason it would have been rare for an African American to own a plantation or to own slaves in the same sense that the Brattons would, is because it would give a higher chance for revolts or rebellions against slavery. Thank you for joining us for another Time Travel Tuesday. You can join us again next week for the next one. And if you do have any questions about anything that I've talked about today, you can leave your questions in the comment section.